Welcome, seekers of hidden truths, to the shadowed corners of a world where mysteries linger like morning mist over ancient battlefields. Tonight, we delve into the unsolved enigmas of Jujutsu Kaisen, those questions that haunt the spaces between technique and understanding, power and purpose. Let your mind drift as we explore the riddles that even the strongest sorcerers could not unravel, the secrets buried beneath centuries of conflict and sacrifice. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and allow yourself to float through these unanswered questions that echo through the halls of Tokyo Jujutsu High and beyond. In the beginning, there was only darkness and the whisper of possibility, a void that existed before curses took form and before humanity learned to fear the shadows that danced at the edges of perception. But from this primordial emptiness emerged something that would reshape the very nature of evil itself, a being whose transformation from human to curse remains one of the most profound mysteries in the annals of Jujutsu history. Tonight, we explore the enigma of Ryomen Sukuna's true origins, tracing the threads of a story that begins in ancient flesh and culminates in legendary malevolence. The man who would become the king of curses was born into a world vastly different from our own, an era when the boundaries between human and supernatural were fluid and permeable, when power was measured not in technique alone, but in the willingness to abandon every constraint that defined ordinary existence. The historical records from the Heian period speak of a sorcerer whose abilities transcended normal categories, someone whose mastery over cursed energy was matched only by his capacity for violence, that knew no moral limitations or strategic restraint. But the mystery that haunts scholars of Jujutsu history is not simply what Sukuna accomplished during his human existence, but how he accomplished the impossible transformation from mortal sorcerer to immortal curse, a metamorphosis that defied every principle that governed the relationship between life and death, humanity and malevolence. The process by which a human consciousness could survive the dissolution of physical form, while retaining not just awareness, but enhanced power, remains unexplained by any theory that contemporary sorcerers have developed. The transformation itself appears to have been voluntary rather than imposed, a conscious choice to abandon humanity in pursuit of something that transcended the limitations that constrained even the most powerful sorcerers. Unlike Rika, whose curse was created by another's desperate love and fear of loss, or the countless spirits born from collective human anxieties, Sukuna's evolution was self-directed, an act of will that reshaped his fundamental nature through means that remain hidden behind centuries of accumulated legend and deliberate obscurity. The fear that surrounded Sukuna during his human years was qualitatively different from the terror that birthed ordinary cursed spirits, reflecting not generalized anxiety about abstract concepts but specific, personal dread of an individual whose power made him a force of nature rather than merely a dangerous person. Those who witnessed his capabilities understood that they were observing someone who had moved beyond normal human categories, whose strength was not just exceptional, but fundamentally alien to their understanding of what mortal beings could achieve. The accumulation of this fear over decades of increasingly legendary violence may have created the spiritual pressure necessary for his transformation, each act of destruction adding layers to a reputation that eventually achieved independent existence, apart from the physical form that had originally contained it. The terror that people felt when they heard his name became a kind of cursed energy in itself, feeding back into his being and gradually reshaping his essential nature from human sorcerer to something approaching a natural disaster, given consciousness and malevolent intent. But the most perplexing aspect of Sukuna's transformation is not the fact that it occurred, but the specific form that it took, the distinctive four-armed, two-faced, two-mouthed configuration that has become synonymous with absolute cursed power. This dramatic physical alteration was not random mutation but purposeful design, each additional appendage serving specific functions that enhanced his combat capabilities, while embodying symbolic meanings that reflected his philosophical evolution beyond normal human concerns and limitations. The explanation provided in later historical documents suggests that his extra arms were designed for the simultaneous performance of multiple techniques, allowing him to maintain offensive capabilities while conducting the complex hand movements and verbal incantations required for his most devastating attacks. The second mouth served a similar function, enabling him to speak curse formulas, while the primary mouth engaged in combat communication or consumption of whatever opponents he chose to devour during battle. But this practical explanation, while accurate, fails to address the deeper significance of his altered form as a rejection of human physical limitations and an embrace of something that transcended ordinary biological constraints. The four arms may have been functional adaptations, but they were also symbolic statements about his refusal to accept the boundaries that defined normal existence, his determination to become something that could reach toward multiple goals simultaneously without compromise or limitation. The two faces that crowned his transformed head represented perhaps the most profound aspect of his evolution, the dual nature that allowed him to perceive reality from multiple perspectives simultaneously, while maintaining the unity of consciousness necessary for coordinated action. This was not split personality or internal conflict, but integrated multiplicity, awareness that could process information and make decisions at speeds that exceeded anything possible within the constraints of ordinary human cognition. The terror that his transformed appearance inspired in those who encountered him was not simply aesthetic revulsion, but instinctive recognition that they were facing something that had deliberately abandoned the common humanity that made communication and negotiation possible. His form announced that he had chosen to become other than human, that attempts to relate to him on the basis of shared mortality and limitation would prove not just futile but potentially catastrophic. The decision to fragment his soul into 20 cursed fingers represents another layer of mystery that deepens rather than resolves questions about his true nature and long-term objectives. This was not simply a method of achieving immortality, but a strategic choice that distributed his consciousness across multiple objects while maintaining the essential unity that made him a coherent entity rather than a collection of independent fragments. The collaboration with Kenjaku that made this fragmentation possible suggests planning that extended far beyond immediate concerns about physical death toward long-term goals that encompassed centuries or millennia of future influence over the development of Jujutsu society. The binding vows and spiritual techniques required for such a complex undertaking would have demanded cooperation between individuals whose combined knowledge represented the pinnacle of what was theoretically possible within the pinnacle, constraints of their era's understanding. But the choice to divide himself into precisely 20 parts was not arbitrary mathematical decision, but symbolic gesture that reflected beliefs about cosmic order and numerical significance that have been lost to contemporary understanding. Each finger became a repository not just for fractional portions of his power, but for specific aspects of his consciousness, memories, and techniques that could function independently while remaining connected to the larger whole that defined his essential identity. The millennium of dormancy that followed his physical death was not mere waiting but active development, his consciousness evolving and adapting, even while contained within cursed objects that prevented direct intervention in the physical world. The experiences and observations that accumulated during this extended period of enforced observation shaped his understanding of how human civilization developed and provided intelligence that would prove crucial when opportunities for resurrection finally presented themselves. The connection between Sukuna and the figure known only as the Angel represents one of the most intriguing aspects of his mysterious past, suggesting relationships and conflicts that extend beyond the purely personal into realms of cosmic significance that touch on fundamental questions about the nature of good and evil, order and chaos, divine authority and rebellious independence. The title of the Fallen One that the Angel bestowed upon him carries implications that reach far beyond mere criminal designation toward theological categories that have shaped human understanding of moral conflict for millennia. The biblical parallels are too numerous and specific to be coincidental, particularly the imagery of torn wings that appears as tattoos across his back, and the suggestion that he was once part of some heavenly hierarchy before choosing rebellion over obedience. Like Lucifer's fall from grace, Sukuna's transformation may have represented not simple moral corruption, but conscious rejection of constraints imposed by authorities whose legitimacy he refused to acknowledge or accept. The massacre of the 5 Void Generals and other elite sorcerers that occurred during his confrontation with the Angel suggests that this was not merely personal conflict, but ideological war between incompatible visions of how power should be exercised and controlled. The Angel's eventual incarnation during the Culling Games and her continued pursuit of vengeance indicates that the issues that divided them during the Heian era remained unresolved despite the passage of centuries. The mystery of what originally motivated Sukuna's rebellion against whatever cosmic order the Angel represented remains hidden behind layers of myth and deliberate obscurity, but the evidence suggests that it involved fundamental disagreements about the relationship between strength and responsibility, individual freedom and collective welfare, the right of the powerful to act according to their desires rather than external moral imperatives imposed by beings who claimed divine authority. The torn wing imagery that marks his transformed body serves as permanent reminder of whatever fall from grace precipitated his transformation. From whatever he was before, into the King of Curses, who terrorized the Heian period with casual displays of overwhelming violence. These are not decorative tattoos, but spiritual scars that mark the moment when he chose to abandon whatever elevated position he had previously occupied in favor of existence that acknowledged no authority beyond his own will and capability. The philosophy that emerged from this transformation was not simple nihilism or arbitrary cruelty, but coherent worldview, based on the principle that strength alone determined moral validity, that those who possessed overwhelming power were justified in exercising it according to their desires, rather than constraints imposed by weaker beings who lacked the capability to enforce their preferred limitations. This was not madness, but alternative ethical framework that most humans found incomprehensible and terrifying. The relationships that Sukuna maintained during his human years with figures like Yorozu and Uraume suggest that his transformation was not complete isolation from all human connection, but selective association with individuals who could appreciate or at least tolerate his evolving philosophy about power and responsibility. These relationships provide glimpses into the person he had been before his full transformation and hint at alternative paths that his development might have taken under different circumstances. The romantic or quasi-romantic connection with Yorozu reveals aspects of his character that survived his transformation into cursed existence, suggesting that even after abandoning humanity, He retained capacity for forms of connection that transcended pure domination or utilitarian calculation. Her devotion to him appears to have been based not on fear or subservience, but on genuine appreciation for qualities that she found compelling despite, or perhaps because of their dangerous nature. The bond with Urame represents a different, but equally significant form of relationship, the master and servant dynamic that was based on mutual respect and shared commitment to goals that transcended ordinary human concerns about safety or conventional morality. Uraume's unwavering loyalty suggests that Sukuna's transformation did not eliminate his capacity to inspire dedication in others, but merely changed the criteria by which such dedication was earned and maintained. These relationships hint at the paths not taken, the alternative forms of development that might have occurred if circumstances had been different, or if he had made different choices about how to respond to the isolation and burden that came with overwhelming power. The tragedy implicit in his transformation is not just what he became, but what he chose not to remain. The human connections and possibilities that he sacrificed in pursuit of transcendence that came at the cost of everything that might have made such transcendence meaningful. The final mystery that surrounds Sukuna's origins is perhaps the most profound. Whether his transformation was truly voluntary, or whether it was the inevitable result of possessing power that exceeded human capacity to contain or channel constructively. The question of whether someone with his capabilities could have chosen differently, could have found ways to remain connected to humanity while exercising strength that placed him beyond normal categories of moral evaluation, remains unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. The evidence suggests that his evolution into cursed existence was not sudden revelation or dramatic moment of choice, but gradual process that occurred over years or decades as he slowly abandoned each constraint that had previously limited his actions or connected him to ordinary human concerns. Each act of violence made the next easier. Each demonstration of superior power increased his sense of separation from those he was theoretically protecting. Each moment of isolation reinforced his growing conviction that strength alone was meaningful in a world where weakness was the common condition. The fear that eventually transformed him from human into curse was not imposed from outside but cultivated from within. His own growing contempt for human limitation, combining with others' terror of his capabilities, to create the spiritual pressure necessary for metamorphosis that defied every natural law governing life and death. He became what people feared he was, but only because he chose to embrace rather than resist their vision of what his power meant and implied. The king of curses who emerged from this transformation was not corruption of his original nature, but fulfillment of potentials that had always existed within him, waiting for circumstances and choices that would allow their full expression without the constraints that human connection and moral consideration had previously imposed. The mystery is not how he became evil, but how someone with his capabilities had ever been anything else. How power of such magnitude had ever been contained within frameworks of responsibility and limitation that were adequate for ordinary human existence. And so the enigma of Sukuna's origins remains fundamentally unsolved, a puzzle that touches on questions about the nature of power, responsibility, transformation, and choice that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of one individual's evolution from human sorcerer to legendary curse. His story is simultaneously unique and universal, reflecting possibilities that exist within any concentration of overwhelming strength when exercised without adequate wisdom or sufficient connection to values that transcend personal desire and capability. The mystery continues to echo through the halls of Jujutsu history, a reminder that some transformations, once begun, cannot be reversed or undone, only accepted as warnings about paths that lead away from humanity towards something that was never meant to wear human form or claim human understanding. Beyond the veils of ordinary perception, where the boundaries between life and death become fluid and permeable, there exists a figure whose very existence challenges every assumption about mortality, consciousness, and the price of immortality. Master Tengen stands as perhaps the most enigmatic presence in the entire Jujutsu world, a being whose thousand-year vigil over Japan's spiritual barriers has required sacrifices that transcend normal understanding of what it means to be human, divine, or something altogether different from either category. The mystery that surrounds Tengen begins not with his current state, but with the fundamental question of what he was, before he became the immortal guardian, whose barrier techniques have protected Japanese civilization from supernatural annihilation for centuries beyond memory. The historical records that might illuminate his origins have been lost to time, deliberately obscured, or transformed into legends so fantastic that truth and myth have become indistinguishable from one another, leaving only fragments of understanding scattered across generations of incomplete knowledge. What we know with certainty is that Tengen achieved immortality through means that required periodic assimilation with specially chosen vessels, young women whose spiritual compatibility with his essence allowed for the renewal that prevented his evolution beyond human comprehension into something that might have been divine or monstrous, depending on one's perspective about the relationship between transcendence and monstrosity, power and wisdom, protection and control over those who required such protection. The star plasma vessel ritual that governed these assimilations was not merely practical necessity but cosmic requirement, a process that maintained the delicate balance between Tengen's continued functionality as protector and his potential transformation into something that might have been more powerful, but also more alien, more capable of defending Japan, but also more likely to view its human population as resources rather than beneficiaries of his protective efforts. The failure of Riko Amanai's assimilation marked the beginning of changes that would eventually lead to circumstances far more catastrophic than anyone at the time could have anticipated. The breakdown of established patterns, creating opportunities for forces like Kenjaku to exploit weaknesses that had previously been contained by Tengen's stable presence and reliable renewal. The assassination that prevented her sacrifice was not just personal tragedy, but systemic failure that undermined the entire framework of supernatural protection that had governed Japan for generations. But the true mystery begins not with the failure of one assimilation, but with what happened to Tengen himself during the period when his evolution could no longer be prevented through traditional means, when his consciousness began the transformation that threatened to elevate him beyond human understanding, while potentially compromising his ability to maintain the barriers that were essential for human survival. The changes that occurred during this period remain largely undocumented, hidden behind layers of institutional secrecy and individual privacy that prevented even close associates from understanding the full implications of his metamorphosis. The relationship between Tengen and Kenjaku that was eventually revealed represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire saga. The discovery that someone who had been trusted with the protection of human civilization had been secretly manipulating circumstances to serve personal goals that were fundamentally incompatible with the welfare of those he was sworn to protect. The binding vows and agreements that facilitated Kenjaku's infiltration of the very institutions that should have prevented such infiltration suggest either corruption or coercion that extended back centuries into carefully hidden history. The merger that Kenjaku planned to force upon Tengen was not simply absorption of power, but fundamental violation of autonomy and identity that would have transformed both beings into something entirely new while destroying what each had been individually. This was not collaboration or evolution, but spiritual rape conducted on a cosmic scale. The forcible combination of essences that had developed along different paths toward different goals with different relationships to the human populations that surrounded them. The philosophical implications of this planned merger extend far beyond tactical considerations about who would control what abilities toward fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness, identity, and the right of individuals to maintain their essential being against forces that seek to reshape them according to external agendas. Tengen's resistance to this forced combination represents not just self-preservation, but defense of principles that touch on the deepest foundations of what it means to exist as a coherent entity rather than merely a collection of useful capabilities. But the mystery deepens when we consider what actually occurred during the final battle between Sukuna and the assembled forces of Jujutsu Society, when Tengen was consumed not through Kenjaku's merger ritual but through direct ingestion by the King of Curses, whose appetite for power extended to absorption of other supernatural entities whose abilities complemented his own existing capabilities. The circumstances that led to this consumption remain largely unexplained, hidden behind the chaos and confusion that characterized the climactic confrontations that determined the fate of human civilization. The discovery of Tengen's remains within Sukuna's body after the final battle raises questions that are perhaps more disturbing than they are illuminating, suggesting that consumption was not complete destruction, but some form of incorporation that preserved aspects of Tengen's consciousness and abilities within Sukuna's expanded repertoire of techniques and knowledge. The implications of such preservation are staggering in their complexity and potential consequences for understanding what survived the apparent deaths of both beings. The question of whether Tengen's consciousness persisted in some form during his period of incorporation within Sukuna touches on mysteries that extend beyond practical concerns about technique inheritance toward profound, philosophical questions about the nature of identity, memory, and awareness under conditions that transcend normal categories of life and death. If some aspect of his essential being remained intact during consumption, what form did that persistence take? And what awareness might he have retained of his circumstances and surroundings? The possibility that Tengen experienced continued consciousness while trapped within Sukuna's expanded form suggests suffering on a scale that challenges comprehension, the ultimate violation of someone whose existence had been dedicated to protecting others, being transformed into involuntary collaboration with forces dedicated to their destruction. The psychological implications of such awareness, if it existed, represent trauma that exceeds normal categories of emotional damage or spiritual violation. But the mystery becomes even more complex when we consider the inheritance that may have passed to Megumi Fushiguro through his possession by Sukuna during the period when Tengen's abilities were incorporated into the King of Curses' expanded capabilities. The 10 Shadows technique that Megumi wielded was fundamentally spatial in nature, dealing with manipulation of dimensions and barriers that bore conceptual similarity to Tengen's own barrier techniques, creating possibilities for compatibility that might not have existed with other sorcerers. The theoretical framework that governs technique inheritance suggests that abilities can be preserved and transmitted under specific circumstances that involve spiritual compatibility, conscious transfer, or involuntary absorption during moments of extreme stress or transformation. Megumi's exposure to both Sukuna's techniques and whatever remained of Tengen's consciousness during his possession created conditions that might have allowed for unprecedented forms of technique transmission that exceeded anything previously documented in Jujutsu history. The implications of Megumi potentially inheriting aspects of Tengen's barrier techniques are staggering in their scope and complexity. suggesting possibilities for reconstruction of Japan's protective barriers under entirely new management, while raising questions about whether someone so young and traumatized would be capable of managing responsibilities that had challenged even Tengen's ancient wisdom and accumulated experience. The weight of such inheritance would be crushing for anyone, but particularly devastating for someone whose psychological state had been compromised by the violations he had endured during his possession. The barrier techniques that Tengen had maintained for centuries were not simply magical constructs, but living systems that required constant attention, adjustment, and renewal through methods that demanded intimate understanding of spiritual geography, cursed energy flow patterns, and the complex relationships between human activity and supernatural manifestation. These were not techniques that could be mastered through normal training methods, but required direct experience and inherited wisdom that had been passed down through generations of careful study and practice. The question of what happens to Japan's protective barriers without Tengen's active maintenance represents perhaps the most immediate practical concern arising from his consumption and apparent destruction, though the discovery of his remains suggests that complete annihilation may not have occurred and that some form of continuity might be possible if the proper conditions could be established for reconstruction or reactivation of dormant systems. The storage of Sukuna's remains, which contained Tengen's preserved essence, in heavily guarded locations protected by barrier techniques, creates a kind of recursive protection system where Tengen's own abilities are being used to safeguard what remains of his physical form while preventing unauthorized access to power that could reshape the entire supernatural landscape of Japan if it fell into wrong hands or was activated through improper methods. But the most profound mystery surrounding Tengen's current state concerns the location and condition of his soul, rather than merely his physical remains or inherited techniques, questions that touch on fundamental beliefs about consciousness, spiritual existence, and the possibility of survival under conditions that challenge every assumption about what constitutes life, death, and the various states that might exist between or beyond those familiar categories. The consumption that Tengen experienced was not ordinary death, but absorption into another entity whose own relationship to normal categories of existence was already highly unconventional, creating circumstances where traditional understanding of what happens to consciousness after physical destruction proves inadequate for explaining the possibilities that might exist within such extraordinary conditions. The soul that had maintained immortal existence for centuries might possess resilience that exceeds even the destructive capabilities of someone like Sukuna. The theological implications of Tengen's situation extend beyond practical concerns about technique, inheritance, or barrier maintenance toward profound questions about the nature of divine or semi-divine beings and their relationship to concepts like salvation, damnation, and spiritual progression that have shaped human religious thought for millennia. If Tengen was indeed something approaching a divine guardian, his apparent destruction represents cosmic tragedy that transcends individual suffering toward universal loss of protection and guidance. But the mystery deepens when we consider the possibility that Tengen's consumption was not accident or simple predation, but fulfillment of some larger pattern or destiny that had been building toward this conclusion for centuries, that the various crises and failures that preceded his final fate were not random tragedies, but components of a larger design that required his sacrifice for purposes that remain hidden behind layers of cosmic significance that human understanding cannot fully grasp. The merger ritual that Kenjaku had originally planned might have been prevented, not through human intervention, but through cosmic forces that recognized the violation it represented and arranged circumstances that led instead to Tengen's absorption by Sukuna, a fate that was tragic, but perhaps less catastrophic than the complete loss of identity that Kenjaku's plans would have entailed. In this interpretation, consumption becomes the lesser evil, preservation of essence rather than complete annihilation of everything Tengen had been. The question of whether some aspect of Tengen's consciousness might eventually re-emerge from whatever state it currently occupies touches on beliefs about spiritual resilience and the possibility of reconstruction or resurrection under conditions that exceed normal understanding of what such processes might entail. If his essence survived consumption in some form, the possibility exists that future circumstances might create opportunities for return or reactivation that could restore his protective capabilities while incorporating whatever wisdom was gained through the extraordinary experiences of his apparent destruction and preservation. The legacy that Tengen leaves behind is not simply the barrier techniques that protected Japan, but the example of dedication and sacrifice that transcended normal human limitations while remaining fundamentally connected to the welfare of those who benefited from such protection. His existence demonstrated that power could be exercised with wisdom and restraint, that immortality could coexist with compassion, that strength could serve protection rather than domination when guided by principles that valued others' welfare above personal comfort or desire. The mystery of what Tengen has become in his current state represents more than academic curiosity about the fate of one individual, but a question that illuminates fundamental truths about sacrifice, protection, and the price that guardians pay for their vigilance over those who cannot protect themselves. His story is simultaneously unique and universal, reflecting the challenges that face anyone who accepts responsibility for others' welfare while possessing power that exceeds normal human categories of strength and limitation. And so the enigma of Master Tengen's true fate continues to echo through the quiet spaces of Jujutsu history, a reminder that some mysteries are too profound for easy resolution, that some sacrifices are too complex for simple understanding, that some forms of protection require prices that challenge every assumption about what individuals should be asked to pay for the safety of others. His legacy persists not in answers, but in questions that invite deeper reflection on the nature of guardianship, immortality, and the eternal tension between power and wisdom that defines the relationship between protectors and protected. In a world where such protection remains eternally necessary and eternally costly, within the shadowed annals of Jujutsu history, few events loom as large or mysterious as the culling game, that ancient ritual of death and transformation that emerged from the deepest darkness of human ambition to reshape civilization itself through carefully orchestrated violence and supernatural manipulation. The game that terrorized modern Japan was not spontaneous creation, but the culmination of plans that had been developing for over a millennium, schemes that required patience and foresight, that exceeded normal human capacity for long-term thinking and strategic development. The origins of the culling game stretch back into the mists of the Heian era, that golden age of Japanese culture which was simultaneously the darkest period in the history of supernatural conflict, when beings like Sukuna and Kenjaku walked the earth with casual authority over life and death that made entire populations tremble at whispered rumors of their presence. During this time of unprecedented magical power and political chaos, the foundations were laid for rituals that would not reach fruition until centuries had passed, and the world had forgotten the true significance of the preparations being made in shadow and secrecy. Kenjaku's role in establishing the game's fundamental structure reveals the depth of planning that went into creating what appeared to be spontaneous outbreak of supernatural violence, but was actually carefully orchestrated. Campaign designed to generate the precise conditions necessary for the merger ritual that represented his ultimate goal. The techniques and knowledge required to maintain such a complex system across centuries demanded not just individual brilliance, but institutional memory and hidden networks of collaboration that operated beneath the surface of recorded history. The idle transfiguration technique that served as the game's primary mechanism for creating new participants represents one of the most disturbing applications of cursed energy manipulation ever documented. The transformation of ordinary humans into weapons and vessels without their knowledge or consent, violations of autonomy and identity that reduced individual people to components in a larger machine designed to harvest cursed energy through fear, violence, and despair. The process by which civilians were marked and transformed into players demonstrates the horrifying efficiency with which supernatural techniques could be applied to population-level manipulation, turning entire cities into hunting grounds where survival depended not on justice or morality but on raw power and willingness to kill others who had been equally victimized by circumstances beyond their understanding or control. The randomness of selection created additional terror, as no one could predict who would become a target or what criteria determined participation in conflicts they had never chosen to join. But the true genius of the game's design lay not in its capacity for generating violence, but in its ability to channel that violence towards specific goals that served Kenjaku's broader agenda, while appearing to operate according to rules that suggested fairness and voluntary participation. The point system that governed advancement and survival created illusions of meritocracy and choice, while actually ensuring that outcomes would favor those whose techniques and psychology aligned with Kenjaku's requirements for the merger ritual he intended to conduct. The barriers that contained each game zone were not simply practical measures to prevent escape, but sophisticated spiritual constructs that served multiple functions simultaneously, containing the violence to prevent broader social disruption while concentrating cursed energy in ways that maximized its potential contribution to the larger ritual that gave the entire enterprise its ultimate meaning and purpose. These barriers represented centuries of accumulated knowledge about spatial manipulation and cursed energy concentration that exceeded anything achieved by previous generations of sorcerers. The rules that governed gameplay were masterpieces of psychological manipulation disguised as fair competition, creating incentives that encouraged the kinds of behavior and conflict that would generate maximum cursed energy, while providing enough flexibility to accommodate the various personalities and moral frameworks that different players brought to their involuntary participation. The apparent logic of the rule structure masked deeper purposes that were designed to serve needs that most participants could not even recognize, much less understand or resist effectively. The mystery of when exactly the modern iteration of the game began touches on questions about the relationship between ancient preparations and contemporary triggers, the specific circumstances that activated systems that had been dormant for centuries while waiting for conditions that would allow their full deployment. The transformation of marked individuals into active players appears to have occurred simultaneously across multiple locations, suggesting coordination that exceeded anything possible through normal communication methods. The role of binding vows in maintaining the game's structure across such vast temporal and geographical scales reveals the sophistication of the magical framework that supported what might otherwise have seemed like chaotic outbreak of supernatural violence. These were not simple contracts, but complex spiritual architectures that bound participants, locations, and even abstract concepts like rules and points into a coherent system that could function independently of its creator's direct oversight. The connection between individual games and the broader merger ritual that represented Kenjaku's ultimate objective demonstrates how seemingly independent conflicts were actually components of much larger design that treated human lives and suffering as raw materials for cosmic transformation that would have reshaped civilization itself according to principles that bore no relationship to human welfare or dignity. Each death contributed to energy accumulation that served purposes extending far beyond the immediate circumstances of individual conflicts. The players who found themselves trapped within this system represented cross-section of humanity that had been selected not for their moral qualities or voluntary participation, but for their potential to generate the kinds of cursed energy that would serve the ritual's requirements while providing enough variety in techniques and approaches to ensure that conflicts would develop along lines that maximized both violence and spiritual energy production. Their individual stories of adaptation, resistance, and survival illuminate the human cost of schemes that operated on scales that dwarfed personal suffering, while being built entirely upon foundations of such suffering. The loopholes that characters like Megumi and Yuji discovered within the rule structure were not oversights, but deliberate features that allowed for the kinds of adaptation and evolution that kept the system dynamic while preventing stagnation that might have reduced its effectiveness as energy-generating mechanism. The ability to add new rules created illusions of agency and control, while actually serving the system's need for continued development and complexity. The international implications of the Culling Games activation reveal how Kenjaku's plans extended beyond Japan toward global transformation that would have affected every human civilization regardless of their knowledge or involvement in supernatural conflicts. The energy being generated through the game was sufficient to power rituals that could reshape reality itself, making every person on Earth a potential casualty of conflicts they had no opportunity to understand or influence. The mystery of how the game's barriers remained stable without Kenjaku's direct oversight after his apparent death suggests either automated systems that could function independently or hidden collaborators who possessed sufficient knowledge and power to maintain structures that required constant attention and adjustment to remain effective. The continued existence of these barriers represents ongoing threat, even after the removal of their original architect. The players who achieved significant point totals through survival and strategic thinking created their own centers of power within the game's structure, mini-hierarchies and alliances that demonstrated how even the most oppressive systems could be adapted and subverted by individuals who refused to accept the roles that had been assigned to them by forces beyond their control. These success stories provide hope that human ingenuity and cooperation can overcome even carefully designed systems of manipulation and control. The psychological trauma experienced by survivors of the game extends beyond immediate physical dangers toward existential challenges that come from participating in systems designed to dehumanize and objectify both participants and victims. The recovery process for those who manage to survive represents ongoing challenge that illuminates the long-term costs of conflicts that treat human beings as expendable resources in pursuit of abstract goals. The question of what happens to accumulated cursed energy after the game's apparent conclusion touches on concerns about whether the spiritual pollution generated through organized violence can ever be completely cleansed, or whether it persists in forms that continue to affect the locations and people who were exposed to such concentrated malevolence. The environmental impact of supernatural conflict may have consequences that extend far beyond immediate casualties. The lessons that can be extracted from analysis of the Culling Game's structure and operation provide insights into how future manipulators might attempt similar schemes while also revealing vulnerabilities and countermeasures that could be developed to prevent such large-scale exploitation of human suffering for supernatural purposes. Understanding these patterns becomes crucial for protecting future generations from similar manipulation. The role of technology in facilitating the game's operation demonstrates how modern communication and surveillance systems can be adapted to serve supernatural purposes that their designers never intended, creating possibilities for manipulation and control that exceed anything possible in previous historical periods when such comprehensive monitoring and coordination would have been impossible. The ethical questions raised by the game's existence extend beyond simple condemnation of its creators toward complex considerations about collective responsibility, individual agency under conditions of extreme coercion, and the moral status of actions taken for survival in systems designed to eliminate conventional moral frameworks through pressure that exceeds normal human capacity for ethical decision-making under stress. The mystery of whether aspects of the game continue to operate in hidden forms, even after the apparent conclusion of its public phase, reflects broader concerns about the persistence of systems designed to function with minimal oversight. While appearing to have been completely dismantled, the institutional knowledge required to create such systems suggests that other individuals or groups might possess sufficient understanding to restart or modify similar programs. The impact on ordinary Japanese society of discovering that their government and institutions had been penetrated by forces capable of transforming entire populations into unwilling participants in supernatural conflicts raises questions about trust, transparency, and accountability that extend far beyond immediate concerns about physical safety toward fundamental issues about the relationship between citizens and the systems that claim to protect them. And so the riddle of the Culling game persists as both historical catastrophe and ongoing mystery, its resolution marked more by exhaustion and circumstance than by complete understanding of all the forces that created and sustained it across centuries of careful preparation and months of devastating implementation. The game's legacy continues to influence the development of Jujutsu society while serving as a reminder that some forms of evil require patience and sophistication that exceed normal human capacity for sustained malevolence, that the most dangerous threats are often those that develop slowly and carefully while appearing to be something entirely different from their true nature and ultimate purpose. In the deepest shadows of Jujutsu history, where memory becomes myth and truth dissolves into legend, there exists a figure whose very existence challenges every assumption about identity, mortality, and the price of transcending the limitations that define ordinary human experience. Kenjaku, the ancient sorcerer whose consciousness has survived for over a millennium through methods that violate every natural law governing life and death, represents perhaps the most profound mystery in the entire chronicle of supernatural conflict and human ambition. The question that haunts scholars who attempt to understand Kenjaku's origins is not simply what he has become through centuries of body swapping and consciousness transfer, but what he was before he began this impossible journey through time and flesh. What form of existence could have provided the foundation for techniques that seem to transcend the fundamental boundaries between individual identity and collective experience, between mortal limitation and something approaching divine persistence? The search for Kenjaku's original body leads into historical darkness that may be deliberately maintained rather than accidentally lost. Archives that were destroyed not by time or neglect, but by conscious effort to eliminate evidence of origins that might reveal weaknesses or provide insights that could be used against someone whose survival depends upon remaining fundamentally unknowable and unpredictable to potential enemies or rivals. The brain that has served as the vehicle for his consciousness across generations of borrowed bodies represents either the most sophisticated application of preservation techniques in recorded history or evidence of supernatural transformation that allowed organic matter to transcend normal biological constraints while retaining the complex neural structures necessary for consciousness, memory, and the advanced cognitive functions required to plan and execute schemes spanning centuries of careful preparation and patient manipulation. But the mystery deepens when we consider whether the brain itself is truly Kenjaku's original form or merely another vessel that he adopted early in his journey toward immortality, a possibility that suggests his true essence might be something far more abstract than physical matter, something that could inhabit and control organic structures without being fundamentally dependent upon their continued existence or normal function. The techniques that enable consciousness transfer between bodies require understanding of spiritual mechanics that exceed anything achieved by contemporary sorcerers, suggesting either access to knowledge that has been lost to modern practitioners or natural abilities that place Kenjaku in category entirely separate from ordinary human sorcerers, regardless of their exceptional power or sophisticated training. The precision required to maintain coherent identity while adapting to different physical forms indicates mastery that approaches divine levels of technique integration. The question of whether Kenjaku was originally human or something else entirely touches on fundamental issues about the nature of cursed spirits and their relationship to human consciousness and identity. If he began as human sorcerer who developed techniques that allowed for transcendence of normal mortality, his story represents the ultimate expression of human ambition and refusal to accept natural limitations. If he emerged as cursed spirit from collective human fears and anxieties, his persistence suggests forms of supernatural evolution that exceed anything documented in traditional spiritual hierarchies. The possibility that Kenjaku represents the embodiment of humanity's fear of chaos itself provides framework for understanding both his abilities and his motivations. The way his very existence seems designed to create and exploit disorder while presenting himself as architect of new forms of organization that serve purposes extending beyond immediate personal benefit toward cosmic transformation that reflects principles fundamentally alien to human welfare and understanding. The chaos that Kenjaku has sown throughout history was not random destruction but carefully orchestrated disruption designed to create conditions that would allow for the implementation of plans requiring specific forms of social, spiritual instability that could not be achieved through normal historical processes or conventional forms of political and military manipulation. His interventions in human affairs were surgical strikes against stability that created opportunities for supernatural influence that might otherwise have remained impossible. The merger that represented his ultimate goal was not simply combination of powerful entities, but fundamental restructuring of reality itself, according to principles that would have eliminated the barriers between human, supernatural, individual, and collective, order and chaos, in ways that reflected his own transcendence of normal categories while imposing that transcendence upon every living being regardless of their desire for such transformation or their capacity to survive it psychologically and spiritually. The binding vows and spiritual contracts that enabled his survival across centuries suggest either unprecedented understanding of Jujutsu mechanics or access to sources of power that operate according to principles that have been deliberately hidden from normal practitioners to prevent the kinds of abuse and exploitation that his existence represents. The stability of these agreements across such vast temporal scales indicates supernatural enforcement that exceeds anything achieved through conventional technique application. The bodies that Kenjaku has inhabited throughout his extended existence were not randomly selected, but carefully chosen, according to criteria that balanced immediate tactical needs with longer-term strategic considerations, each vessel providing specific capabilities or access to resources that served his evolving plans, while advancing his understanding of human nature and supernatural mechanics through direct experience of different forms of physical and spiritual existence. The psychological adaptation required to maintain coherent identity while experiencing existence through fundamentally different physical forms suggests either extraordinary mental flexibility or some form of consciousness that was never entirely human to begin with, awareness that could accommodate radical changes in sensory experience and physical capability without losing essential continuity of purpose and memory that defined his core identity across transformations. The relationships that Kenjaku formed with historical figures like Sukuna demonstrate his capacity for long-term alliance and cooperation, despite his fundamental nature as manipulator and exploiter of others' weaknesses and désir. These partnerships were not simple transactions, but complex arrangements that required understanding of psychology and motivation, sophisticated enough to maintain cooperation across centuries while serving goals that ultimately prioritized his interests above those of his temporary allies. The contracts that bound him to participate in future conflicts like the culling game represent examples of planning that required not just strategic foresight but supernatural methods of ensuring compliance and participation across temporal scales that challenged normal understanding of commitment and obligation. These agreements functioned as temporal anchors that maintained consistency of purpose despite the changes in circumstances and personnel that occurred over centuries of historical development. The knowledge that Kenjaku accumulated through direct observation and participation in major historical events provides him with perspective on human nature and social development that no normal individual could possess, understanding based on first-hand experience of how civilizations rise and fall, how ideologies emerge and evolve, how power structures adapt to changing conditions while maintaining essential characteristics that can be predicted and manipulated by those with sufficient patience and insight. The question of whether Kenjaku retains memories from all his previous incarnations, or whether consciousness transfer involves selective preservation that might eliminate traumatic or unnecessary experiences, touches on fundamental issues about the nature of identity and continuity of self under conditions that transcend normal categories of individual existence and personal history. The gender ambiguity that surrounds Kenjaku's original form reflects either deliberate obscuration of identity markers that might provide insight into his true nature, or genuine transcendence of categories that most humans consider fundamental to individual identity and social organization. His ability to inhabit bodies of different genders without apparent psychological difficulty suggests either extraordinary adaptability or consciousness that was never entirely bound by such distinctions. The techniques that he developed for consciousness, preservation, and transfer represent innovations that push Jujutsu theory beyond its traditional boundaries, toward applications that blur the lines between technique and fundamental alteration of reality itself, methods that treat individual identity as malleable rather than fixed, as resource to be managed, rather than essential characteristic to be preserved and protected. The legacy that Kenjaku has created through centuries of manipulation extends beyond immediate damage to include fundamental changes in how supernatural conflict operates and how power is understood and exercised by those who possess exceptional abilities. His influence has shaped the development of Jujutsu society in ways that may persist long after his apparent destruction. creating patterns of thought and behavior that serve his interests even without his direct involvement. The question of whether his consciousness could survive the apparent destruction of his physical form touches on mysteries about the relationship between identity and matter that challenge every assumption about what constitutes death and brain chiz. What forms of existence might be possible for beings who have transcended normal categories through techniques that operate according to principles that remain hidden from conventional understanding? The possibility that Kenjaku might return through methods that have not yet been discovered or implemented reflects concerns about the persistence of consciousness that has achieved independence from normal biological constraints while retaining the sophisticated cognitive abilities necessary for continued planning and manipulation of circumstances that serve long-term goals, extending beyond immediate survival toward cosmic transformation. The students and colleagues who survived his various schemes carry within themselves knowledge and techniques that he developed or influenced, creating possibilities for inadvertent continuation of his work through individuals who may not fully understand the implications of abilities they inherited or learned through contact with his innovations in consciousness, manipulation, and reality alteration. The institutions that he infiltrated and influenced throughout his extended existence may retain structural modifications and hidden protocols that serve his interests, even after his removal from direct oversight, creating ongoing vulnerabilities that could be exploited by other entities with sufficient understanding of his methods and sufficient ambition to attempt implementation of plans that he initiated but did not complete. And so the enigma of Kenjaku's true origins and ultimate fate persists as one of the most disturbing mysteries in Jujutsu history, representing not just individual aberration but systematic challenge to assumptions about identity, mortality, and the relationship between consciousness and physical existence that have profound implications for understanding what human beings might become when freed from normal constraints while remaining fundamentally hostile to the welfare of Palm. Those who continue to accept such limitations as necessary, components of meaningful existence and social cooperation. In the vast tapestry of jujutsu techniques that have shaped supernatural conflict throughout history, few phenomena challenge conventional understanding as profoundly as the domain expansion achieved by Yuji Itadori during his final confrontation with the King of Curses, where every documented domain had been designed as battlefield for overwhelming opponents through superior force and environmental manipulation. Yuji's manifestation represented something entirely unprecedented in its approach to conflict resolution and its fundamental philosophy about the relationship between power and human connection. The appearance of his domain defied every expectation that observers might have held about what the pinnacle of jujutsu technique should look like when deployed by someone whose development had been shaped by hosting the most malevolent entity in recorded history. Instead of apocalyptic landscapes designed to facilitate destruction, witnesses found themselves transported to what appeared to be ordinary residential neighborhood, where the most dramatic events were casual conversations between former enemies who had discovered unexpected common ground in their shared experiences of loss and isolation. The peaceful suburban setting that contained Yuji and Sukuna during their final exchange was not accident of inexperience or failure of imagination, but deliberate choice that reflected the user's fundamental understanding of what his domain needed to accomplish in order to serve purposes that transcended simple victory or defeat. This was not arena designed for combat, but sanctuary created for communication, space where barriers between opposing consciousnesses could dissolve long enough for genuine understanding to develop despite centuries of accumulated hostility and ideological conflict. The philosophical implications of creating domain expansion specifically designed for empathy rather than elimination challenge every assumption about how supernatural power should be exercised when facing existential threats that require decisive action to prevent catastrophic consequences. Traditional Jujutsu wisdom emphasized overwhelming opponents before they could deploy their own abilities, but Yuji's approach represented fundamental rejection of such strategies in favor of methods that prioritized understanding over dominance, connection over conquest. The theoretical framework that would allow for domain expansion focused on emotional and psychological effects rather than physical manipulation, represents innovation in technique development that pushes Jujutsu theory beyond its traditional boundaries toward applications that blur the lines between combat art and therapeutic intervention, between warfare and counseling, between destruction and healing in ways that previous generations of sorcerers would have considered impossible or counterproductive. The sure-hit effect that governed Yuji's domain was not magical compulsion that forced specific behaviors or thoughts, but creation of conditions that made genuine communication possible between individuals whose relationship had been defined by mutual hostility and fundamental incompatibility of goals and values. The technique stripped away defensive barriers and psychological armor that normally prevented honest exchange between enemies, creating vulnerability that was simultaneously dangerous and necessary for meaningful dialogue. The manifestation of ordinary human experiences and environments within the domain reflected Yuji's deep understanding that Sukuna's fundamental isolation from humanity was not choice born from inherent evil, but consequence of circumstances that had prevented him from developing the bloat, connections and relationships that might have provided alternatives to the path of absolute power, and casual violence that had defined his existence for over a millennium. The conversations that occurred within this unprecedented domain were not simple exchanges of information or attempts at negotiation, but profound explorations of identity, purpose, and the meaning of existence that had been impossible during their previous interactions, when immediate survival concerns and tactical considerations prevented the kind of reflection and honest communication that genuine understanding required. The domain created temporal and psychological space for processing experiences that had been too overwhelming for conscious examination during normal circumstances. The healing that began to occur during these exchanges was not supernatural cure for psychological trauma, but natural result of being seen and understood by someone who possessed sufficient empathy and emotional intelligence to recognize the pain that underlay behaviors that appeared to be motivated by pure malevolence or casual cruelty. Yuji's ability to perceive Sukuna's underlying humanity despite centuries of accumulated evil represented triumph of compassion over judgment that challenged every assumption about the nature of redemption and forgiveness. The technique's effectiveness in reaching aspects of Sukuna's consciousness that had been buried beneath layers of rage and contempt demonstrated that even the most thoroughly corrupted individuals retain elements of their original humanity that can be accessed through appropriate methods and sufficient patience, understanding, and willingness to risk vulnerability in service of communication that transcends normal categories of enemy and ally, victim and perpetrator. But the domain's peaceful appearance concealed profound dangers that were perhaps more threatening than conventional combat techniques because they required emotional courage rather than physical strength, willingness to confront uncomfortable truths rather than simply demonstrate superior power, acceptance of vulnerability rather than maintenance of protective barriers that prevented genuine connection, while ensuring continued isolation and mutual hostility. The risk that Yuji accepted by creating space for honest communication with someone who had spent centuries perfecting methods of manipulation and exploitation, was enormous, representing faith in human potential for growth and change that extended even to beings who had apparently abandoned every trace of constructive values in favor of principles that celebrated destruction and suffering as ends in themselves, rather than unfortunate necessities in pursuit of legitimate goals. The courage required to deploy domain expansion, specifically designed to help rather than harm someone who had been responsible for enormous suffering and whose continued existence represented ongoing threat to everyone Yuji cared about, demonstrates moral strength that exceeds anything achievable through conventional training or technique development, wisdom that comes from direct experience of trauma and loss rather than theoretical understanding of ethical principles. The innovation that Yuji's domain represented in terms of technique theory extends beyond its immediate application toward fundamental reconsideration of what domain expansion could accomplish when approached from perspective that prioritized healing over harm, understanding over victory, long-term resolution over immediate tactical advantage that might create more problems than it solved while failing to address underlying causes of conflict. The environmental details that populated his domain were not random elements, but carefully chosen symbols and experiences that reflected aspects of ordinary human life that Sukuna had abandoned or been denied access to during his transformation from whatever he had been originally into the King of Cell. Curses whose existence was defined by power and isolation rather than connection and meaning, derived from relationships with others who could provide perspective and emotional support. The temporal aspects of the domain's function created conditions where past, present, and future could be examined without the pressure of immediate consequences, or the distortion that comes from defending positions that have been adopted for survival rather than conviction, allowing for reassessment of choices and values that might have been different under different circumstances or with different support systems and guidance. The psychological safety that the domain provided was not elimination of all risk, but creation of conditions where risk could be acknowledged and accepted as necessary component of growth and change rather than threat to be avoided or defended against through methods that prevented the kind of vulnerability that genuine communication requires, but that most individuals find too dangerous to attempt with former enemies. The success that Yuji achieved in reaching Sukuna's buried humanity was not guaranteed outcome, but result of specific combination of technique, innovation, emotional intelligence, moral courage, and circumstances that created unique opportunity for breakthrough that might not have been possible under different conditions or with different participants whose backgrounds and motivations were shaped by different experiences and values. The implications of domain expansion designed for therapy rather than combat extend far beyond immediate tactical considerations toward fundamental questions about how supernatural power should be understood and deployed in service of goals that transcend individual victory or survival toward collective healing and social reconstruction that addresses underlying causes of conflict rather than simply managing their symptoms through superior force. The legacy that Yuji's unprecedented domain represents for future development of Jujutsu technique and philosophy touches on possibilities for applications that previous generations never considered because their understanding of power was shaped by environments where immediate survival required overwhelming opponents rather than understanding them, where mercy was luxury that could not be afforded given the stakes involved in most supernatural conflicts. And so the mystery of Yuji's domain expansion persists not as question requiring definitive answer, but as invitation to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between power and purpose, strength and wisdom, victory and healing, in ways that might inform approaches to conflict resolution that transcend traditional categories while remaining grounded in practical understanding of what human nature can accomplish when supported by appropriate techniques and sufficient courage to attempt solutions that seem impossible until someone demonstrates their effectiveness through direct application and willingness to risk failure in service of goals that exceed personal safety or conventional definitions of success. Within the shadowed halls of Jujutsu society, where ancient bloodlines have maintained power through carefully guarded techniques and political influence that spans generations of accumulated wealth and supernatural authority, no clan's fall has been as dramatic or as complete as that of the Zenin family, whose patriarchal structure and systematic oppression of those deemed inferior finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions and the righteous fury of someone who refused to accept the limitations that tradition had imposed upon her existence. The Zenin clan's commitment to maintaining hierarchy based on cursed technique inheritance rather than individual merit or moral character had created internal tensions that festered for generations while being carefully concealed behind facades of family unity and shared purpose that masked deep resentments and systematic abuse that treated human beings as breeding stock for producing powerful techniques rather than individuals worthy of respect and consideration, regardless of their supernatural capabilities. The patriarchal structure that governed every aspect of clan life was not simply preference for male leadership, but comprehensive system of oppression that reduced women to property whose value was determined entirely by their capacity to bear children who might inherit valuable techniques, or their utility as marriage alliances that could advance the clan's political and economic interests without regard for their personal desires or individual potential for achievement and happiness. Maki Zenin's rebellion against this system was not sudden explosion of anger, but culmination of years of accumulated frustration and abuse that had been building toward inevitable confrontation, as she developed both the physical capabilities necessary to challenge the clan's authority and the moral clarity required to recognize that reform from within was impossible when dealing with institutions whose fundamental principles were incompatible with basic human dignity and equality. The systematic destruction that she brought to the clan compound was not random violence, but carefully targeted elimination of specific individuals whose positions within the family hierarchy made them responsible for perpetuating systems of oppression that had damaged countless lives while preventing the kind of progressive change that might have allowed the clan to adapt to contemporary values and expectations about how power should be exercised and distributed. The revolutionary nature of Maki's actions extended beyond personal revenge toward fundamental challenge to the entire concept of inherited authority that had governed Jujutsu society for centuries, demonstrating through direct action that traditional hierarchies could be dismantled by individuals who possessed sufficient courage and capability to confront forces that had previously seemed unassailable due to their historical precedent and institutional support. The techniques that she employed during her campaign of destruction were not simply applications of superior physical strength, but sophisticated understanding of how fear and intimidation had been used to maintain control over clan members, who might otherwise have resisted or challenged policies that served the interests of leadership while imposing costs on everyone else who was expected to sacrifice personal welfare for collective advancement. The psychological impact of witnessing someone they had dismissed as inferior systematically dismantling their power structure forced surviving clan members to confront uncomfortable truths about the arbitrary nature of the authority they had accepted as natural and inevitable. Recognition that strength was not distributed according to traditional categories, and that resistance was possible for those willing to accept the risks that meaningful change always required. The survivors who emerged from Maki's campaign of institutional destruction found themselves in an unprecedented situation where traditional sources of identity and purpose had been eliminated while new structures for organizing their relationships and responsibilities had not yet been established, creating uncertainty about how to proceed while processing trauma that came from witnessing the violent collapse of everything they had been taught to value and respect. The relationship between Maki and Megumi, as the two surviving members of the Zenin clan, represents complex negotiation between different approaches to inherited responsibility and the question of whether traditional techniques and knowledge should be preserved, despite their association with systems of oppression that had caused enormous suffering while producing undeniable benefits in terms of supernatural protection and technical innovation. Megumi's position as inheritor of the Ten Shadows technique creates particular complications given the historical significance of this ability within the clan's power structure and its role in maintaining their political influence within Jujutsu society, raising questions about whether techniques themselves are tainted by the contexts in which they were developed and transmitted, or whether they can be separated from their historical associations and deployed in service of different values and goals. The Ten Shadows technique's unique characteristics and its connection to the Zenin clan's traditional role within the broader Jujutsu community touches on mysteries about the origins of inherited abilities and their relationship to bloodline inheritance that may be more complex than simple genetic transmission of supernatural capabilities through normal reproductive processes that govern other aspects of human development and individual variation. The political implications of the Zenin clan's near extinction extend far beyond immediate concerns about power redistribution within Jujutsu society toward fundamental questions about how traditional institutions should be reformed or replaced when their foundational principles are incompatible with contemporary understanding of human rights and individual dignity that have evolved beyond the assumptions that guided their original establishment. The knowledge that has been lost through the elimination of clan elders and senior members represents irreplaceable cultural heritage that included not just technical information about cursed energy manipulation, but historical cracks, understanding of how supernatural conflicts had been managed and resolved in previous generations, wisdom that might have proven valuable for addressing contemporary challenges despite its association with problematic social structures. The hidden techniques and specialized applications that were developed over centuries of clan research and experimentation may have disappeared entirely with the deaths of individuals who served as repositories for knowledge that was never written down or shared beyond small circles of trusted family members, creating gaps in contemporary understanding that could prove significant when facing new forms of supernatural threat or opportunity. The economic and political networks that the Zenin clan maintained through generations of careful alliance building and strategic marriages created power structures that extended far beyond their immediate family toward connections with other influential groups whose own stability and effectiveness may have been compromised by the sudden removal of partners and allies whose support had been integral to their continued success and influence. The reformation possibilities that exist for the surviving remnants of the clan depend largely on whether Maki and Megumi can develop alternative organizational structures that preserve valuable aspects of their inherited responsibilities while eliminating the oppressive elements that made the traditional system incompatible with contemporary values about equality and individual rights that have become central to how Jujutsu society understands its role in protecting human welfare. The question of whether a clan can continue to exist with only two surviving members touches on fundamental issues about the nature of family identity and collective responsibility that extend beyond practical concerns about technique, inheritance toward philosophical questions about what constitutes continuity of tradition, and how much change institutions can absorb while maintaining essential characteristics that give them meaning and purpose. The leadership vacuum created by the elimination of the Zenin clan's traditional authority structure has implications that reach beyond immediate concerns about how their former responsibilities will be distributed among other individuals and institutions toward longer-term questions about how Jujutsu society will reorganize itself to address needs that the clan had previously fulfilled despite their problematic methods and motivations. The psychological healing that surviving clan members will require to process the trauma of witnessing their entire world collapse while adapting to circumstances where traditional sources of identity and purpose are no longer available, represents ongoing challenge that may take years or decades to resolve completely, while creating vulnerabilities that hostile forces might attempt to exploit for their own purposes and advancement. The lessons that other traditional families and institutions have learned from observing the Zenin clan's destruction may influence their own approaches to internal reform and adaptation, creating ripple effects throughout Jujutsu society, as established powers recognize that resistance to necessary change may result in consequences far more severe than the compromises that voluntary evolution would require. The precedent that Maki's actions established for individual resistance to institutional oppression has implications that extend beyond the specific circumstances of clan politics toward broader questions about the relationship between personal conscience and collective authority, individual rights and traditional responsibilities that define how supernatural powers should be understood and exercised in contemporary society. And so the mystery of what will emerge from the ashes of the Zenin clan's destruction continues to unfold as survivors struggle to create new forms of organization and identity that honor valuable aspects of their heritage while rejecting elements that were incompatible with human dignity and equality, seeking balance between preservation and progress that allows for continued effectiveness in their supernatural responsibilities while eliminating sources of suffering that had made their traditional structure a source of trauma rather than strength for those whose lives were shaped by its influence and expectations. Among the great mysteries that shroud the most powerful families in Jujutsu society, none presents as profound an enigma as the Gojo clan itself, that ancient bloodline which produced the strongest sorcerer of the modern era, yet remained almost entirely invisible during the greatest crises that threatened the survival of human civilization. The absence of other clan members during conflicts that should have mobilized every available resource raises questions that extend far beyond simple tactical considerations toward fundamental puzzles about family structure, inherited responsibility, and the true nature of power that transcends individual capability to encompass institutional influence that operates through channels hidden from ordinary observation. The historical records that document the Gojo family's rise to prominence reveal a pattern of exceptional individuals appearing at crucial moments in Jujutsu history, wielders of the Six Eyes and Limitless technique, whose contributions to supernatural conflict were so decisive that their very existence altered the balance of power between human civilization and the forces that sought its power, destruction. Yet despite this legacy of extraordinary service and sacrifice, the clan as collective entity remained curiously absent from contemporary events that should have demanded their full participation and support. Satoru Gojo's apparent status as the sole active representative of his family during the modern era creates paradoxes that challenge every assumption about how powerful clans organize themselves and distribute responsibilities among members whose collective capabilities should exceed anything achievable by individual effort, regardless of personal strength or technical mastery. The concentration of all visible authority and responsibility in one person suggests either unprecedented trust in individual judgment or systematic elimination of alternative leadership that might have provided different perspectives on strategic priorities and tactical approaches. The political influence that the Gojo name commanded within Jujutsu society extended far beyond Satoru's personal reputation and demonstrated capabilities toward institutional power that had been accumulated over generations of careful alliance building and strategic positioning within hierarchies that governed supernatural conflict and its relationship to ordinary human society. This influence operated through networks that remained largely invisible to outside observers while providing access to resources and information that exceeded anything available to other individuals or organizations. The mystery deepens when we consider the economic foundations that supported such extensive political influence without visible sources of wealth generation or business enterprises that might have provided the material resources necessary for maintaining position within social structures where financial capability was essential for effective operation and continued relevance. The clan's ability to function as significant political entity while remaining economically invisible suggests either hidden assets or alternative forms of value creation that operated according to principles different from conventional business practices. The six eyes that defined the clan's supernatural inheritance represented more than simply powerful technique, but cosmic constant that the universe itself maintained through mechanisms that ensured continuous presence of this capability within human population, regardless of individual survival or family continuity. The description of this inheritance as fundamental force of nature, comparable to gravity or electromagnetism, suggests that the Gojo bloodline served as vessel for power that transcended ordinary genetic transmission while remaining dependent upon biological inheritance for its manifestation. The implications of such cosmic responsibility for family structure and individual development create pressures that most human organizations would find impossible to bear, requiring adaptation to circumstances where one member's capabilities might eclipse everyone else's contributions, while creating dependencies that could prove catastrophic if that individual was eliminated or incapacitated. The psychological toll of living in shadow of such overwhelming capability would challenge normal family relationships, while creating incentives for either worship or resentment that could destroy healthy interpersonal dynamics. The absence of other Gojo clan members from major conflicts like the Shibuya incident and the Culling game suggests either strategic withdrawal from visible participation in supernatural warfare or systematic exclusion from 7 decision-making processes that concentrated all authority in Satoru's individual judgment, regardless of collective wisdom that might have been available from family members with different perspectives and experiences. The possibility that other clan members possessed variations of the limitless technique without the 6 eyes that would allow for full mastery creates intriguing questions about hidden capabilities that might have provided significant tactical advantages if properly coordinated with Satoru's overwhelming individual strength. The combination of multiple users with complementary abilities could have achieved effects that exceeded anything possible through solo operation, regardless of personal power level or technique sophistication. The educational implications of clan structure that placed all visible responsibility on one member while maintaining traditional knowledge and techniques that required transmission across generations, suggests either highly efficient, private instruction methods or institutional arrangements that kept most family members isolated from public activity while ensuring continued development of capabilities that might prove crucial under different circumstances or leadership transitions. The compound where Satoru spent his childhood was described as fortress-like installation that provided security adequate for protecting someone whose elimination was priority target for hostile forces throughout the supernatural world, but the resources required for maintaining such extensive protective measures suggests infrastructure and personnel that exceeded anything one individual could coordinate effectively without significant family support and institutional backing. The political maneuvering that Satoru employed to protect students like Yuji from institutional persecution demonstrated sophisticated understanding of Jujutsu society's power structures and decision-making processes that suggested either exceptional individual insight or access to family knowledge about how influence could be exercised most effectively within systems that operated according to complex protocols and traditional relationships. The question of succession planning within clan, whose primary inheritance was cosmic constant that could only be possessed by one individual at a time, creates unique challenges for ensuring continuity of family influence and institutional responsibilities that extended beyond personal capability toward collective obligations that had been accumulated over centuries of service and sacrifice in supernatural conflicts. The hidden techniques and specialized applications that might have been developed over generations of clan research and experimentation could represent valuable resources that remained untapped during recent crises due to concentration of all tactical decision-making in individual judgment that lacked access to full range of family capabilities and accumulated knowledge about alternative approaches to common problems. The international connections that powerful families typically maintained through centuries of diplomatic and economic relationship building might have provided resources and intelligence that could have altered outcomes of major conflicts if family members with responsibility for such networks had been integrated into strategic planning and tactical coordination during critical periods. The mystery of whether Satoru's death will prompt emergence of previously invisible family members who had remained in background while he carried primary responsibility for clan obligations touches on questions about institutional continuity and adaptive capacity that could prove crucial for understanding how Jujutsu society will reorganize itself following loss of its most powerful individual protector. The potential for hidden heirs or branch families that might possess partial inheritance of clan capabilities creates possibilities for future developments that could significantly alter balance of power within supernatural community while raising questions about why such resources were not mobilized during recent crises when additional strength could have prevented enormous casualties and systemic damage. The legacy systems and institutional arrangements that the Gojo clan established over centuries of political influence may continue to operate even without direct family oversight, creating ongoing effects that shape Jujutsu society's development while remaining largely invisible to outside observers who focus on immediate tactical considerations rather than deeper structural influences that determine long-term strategic directions and policy priorities. And so the enigma of the Gojo clan's true nature and current status persists as one of the most intriguing mysteries in contemporary Jujutsu society, representing questions about family structure, inherited responsibility, and the relationship between individual capability and collective influence that extend far beyond immediate concerns about technique inheritance toward fundamental issues about how power is organized, transmitted, and exercised within institutions that claim authority over supernatural conflict, while remaining accountable to communities that depend upon their continued effectiveness and moral integrity in protecting human welfare against forces that threaten civilization itself. In the frozen landscapes of loyalty that transcend ordinary human understanding, where devotion becomes a force more enduring than mountains and more constant than the turning of seasons, there exists a figure whose very existence challenges every assumption about the nature of service, dedication, and the bonds that can develop between beings whose power places them beyond normal categories of relationship and mutual dependence. Uraume, the enigmatic servant whose thousand-year commitment to Sukuna represents perhaps the most profound mystery of unwavering loyalty in the entire chronicle of supernatural conflict and human connection. The riddle of Uraume's true identity begins with questions that extend far beyond simple biographical curiosity toward fundamental puzzles about the nature of consciousness, memory, and individual identity that have been preserved across temporal scales that challenge normal understanding of what constitutes continuous existence and coherent personality under conditions that transcend ordinary human experience and biological limitation. The gender ambiguity that surrounds Uraume's presentation and self-identification reflects either deliberate cultivation of mystery that serves tactical purposes or genuine transcendence of categories that most humans consider fundamental to individual identity and social organization. The fluidity with which they navigate expectations and assumptions about masculine and feminine characteristics suggests either sophisticated understanding of how such categorization can be manipulated or natural existence that predates or transcends such distinctions entirely. The age that Uraume has achieved through unknown methods of longevity or resurrection indicates access to techniques or natural capabilities that place them in category entirely separate from ordinary human sorcerers, regardless of their exceptional abilities or sophisticated training in cursed energy manipulation and spiritual development. The preservation of consciousness and personality across centuries suggests either supernatural inheritance or deliberate transformation that allowed for transcendence of normal biological constraints while maintaining essential human characteristics. The relationship between Uraume and Sukuna that began during the Heian era represents bond that was forged under circumstances where both individuals possessed power that isolated them from ordinary human society while creating opportunities for connection based on mutual recognition of shared experiences with exceptional ability and the loneliness that such capability inevitably imposed upon those who wielded it effectively. The master and servant dynamic that characterized their interaction was not simple hierarchy based on superior power demanding obedience from weaker individuals, but complex relationship that involved mutual respect, shared goals, and complementary capabilities that created partnership, despite obvious differences in raw strength and historical significance within supernatural community and its ongoing conflicts with forces that threatened human civilization. The culinary expertise that Uraume provided for Sukuna's dietary preferences represents aspect of their relationship that reveals intimate understanding of personal tastes and individual needs that extended far beyond tactical cooperation toward genuine care for someone whose welfare mattered, on levels that transcended strategic calculation or political alliance based on temporary convergence of interests and objectives. The significance of food preparation as expression of devotion and care touches on fundamental aspects of human relationship that persist even under conditions where normal social structures have been abandoned in favor of arrangements based purely on power and capability rather than conventional moral frameworks or traditional expectations about mutual obligation and reciprocal support between individuals who choose to associate with one another. The preservation techniques that Uraume employed in maintaining fresh ingredients for meals that satisfied Sukuna's particular preferences for human flesh demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both practical cooking methods and spiritual principles that govern the relationship between consumption and power, nutrition, and cursed energy development that most sorcerers never master, despite extensive training in related areas. The ice techniques that defined Uraume's combat capabilities were not simply applications of elemental manipulation, but expressions of philosophical approach to conflict that emphasized preservation, control, and precise application of force, rather than overwhelming destruction or dramatic displays of individual power that might have been more immediately impressive but less strategically effective under specific tactical conditions. The symbolism of ice as element associated with preservation and stasis creates intriguing connections to Uraume's role in maintaining continuity of service and dedication across temporal scales that challenge normal understanding of commitment and loyalty, their techniques reflecting deeper principles about resistance to change and decay that govern their approach to relationships and responsibility. The loyalty that Uraume demonstrated towards Sukuna was not blind obedience based on fear or intimidation, but conscious choice to dedicate existence to serving someone whose goals and values aligned with their own understanding of what was meaningful and worthwhile. Despite obvious moral complications and potential consequences for their own welfare and development as individual conscious being, the binding vow that may have governed their relationship creates possibilities for understanding how such extraordinary dedication could be maintained across centuries of separation and changing circumstances, while preserving essential characteristics of devotion and service that transcended immediate tactical considerations or temporary shifts in strategic priorities and resource allocation. The sacrifice that such binding would have required suggests either extraordinary faith in Sukuna's worthiness as recipient of such dedication or supernatural compulsion that eliminated normal capacity for reassessment and adaptation that allows most individuals to modify their commitments based on changing understanding of circumstances and consequences that emerge through experience and reflection. The moment when Uraume chose to fade away upon Sukuna's final defeat represents completion of purpose that had defined their existence for over a millennium, acceptance that their role was finished, and that continued existence without the master who had given their life. Meaning would be hollow continuation, rather than meaningful activity worthy of someone whose capabilities exceeded normal human parameters. The ice dust that marked their dissolution was not simply dramatic visual effect, but symbolic representation of how their essential nature had been preserved in crystalline form that could maintain perfect structure until the moment when external conditions no longer supported continued existence, according to principles that had governed their identity and purpose throughout their extraordinary extended lifetime. The connection between their disappearance and Sukuna's death suggests either supernatural bond that linked their vital forces or conscious decision to follow their master into whatever realm awaited beings whose existence had transcended normal categories of life and death while remaining fundamentally connected to human concerns and relationships despite their exceptional capabilities and unusual circumstances. The timing of their dissolution during combat with Hikari represents missed opportunity for resolution of conflict that had demonstrated both their individual capabilities and their continued commitment to goals that extended beyond personal survival toward larger principles about loyalty, service, and the meaning of existence that transcends immediate tactical considerations or strategic advantage. The samurai-like commitment that characterized their approach to service reflects cultural values about dedication and honor that had been adapted to supernatural circumstances while maintaining essential characteristics that gave such commitment meaning and moral significance despite obvious differences between traditional human society and the extraordinary conditions that governed their relationship with Sukuna. The mystery of what motivated their original decision to dedicate existence to serving someone whose philosophy and methods were incompatible with conventional moral frameworks touches on questions about the nature of loyalty itself and whether such devotion can be justified by personal connection and mutual respect when it serves goals that cause enormous suffering to innocent individuals who lack power to protect themselves. The possibility that Uraume's loyalty was based on understanding of Sukuna's original nature that preceded his transformation into the King of Curses suggests that their commitment may have been to person he had been, rather than monster he became. Dedication that persisted despite changes that might have justified reassessment of their relationship and obligations. And so, the enigma of Uraume's eternal devotion persists as testament to possibilities for human connection that transcend ordinary limitations, while raising profound questions about the nature of service, loyalty, and dedication that extends beyond reasonable bounds toward forms of commitment that challenge normal understanding of healthy relationship and individual autonomy, creating legacy that inspires both admiration for extraordinary faithfulness and concern about the psychological and moral costs of such complete subordination of personal welfare to another's desires and objectives regardless of their ultimate worth or compatibility with broader human values and welfare in the shadowed corners of family histories that remain deliberately obscured, where absent guardians leave questions more haunting than their presence ever could. There exist mysteries that touch upon the most fundamental aspects of identity and belonging that shape young lives in ways both profound and subtle. The vanishing parents who should have provided guidance and protection to extraordinary children like Yuji Itadori and Nobara Kujisaki represent not merely personal tragedies, but systematic patterns that suggest deeper forces at work in determining how powerful sorcerers develop their relationships to family, responsibility, and the burden of inherited capability. The mystery of Jin Itadori's disappearance from his son's life begins with questions that extend far beyond simple abandonment toward complex considerations about knowledge, complicity, and the psychological toll of discovering that the person you love has been replaced by something alien and malevolent, wearing their familiar form. The revelation that Kari had been possessed by Kenjaku creates retrospective horror about every intimate moment, shared with someone who was no longer the person Jin had married, every conversation that might have revealed the substitution, if he had possessed sufficient understanding of supernatural possibilities to recognize the signs. The timeline of Jin's realization about his wife's true condition remains frustratingly unclear, raising questions about whether his departure was motivated by conscious recognition of the deception that had made his marriage a lie, or whether subtler forms of psychological manipulation had driven him away through means he could never have understood or articulated. The possibility that he lived for years with growing sense of wrongness about someone he was supposed to trust completely represents form of psychological torture that challenges normal understanding of what individuals can endure while maintaining sanity and coherent identity. The role that Grandpa Itadori played in protecting Yuji from knowledge about his parents suggests either deliberate conspiracy to conceal dangerous truths or protective instinct that recognized the psychological damage such information might cause to a young person already struggling with extraordinary circumstances beyond normal adolescent experience. The old man's dying words about telling Yuji the truth indicate burden of knowledge that had weighed upon him throughout his grandson's childhood, while creating moral conflicts about when and how such revelations should be shared. The question of whether Jin knew about Kenjaku's plans for his son touches upon possibilities that transform him from innocent victim of supernatural deception into potential collaborator whose complicity in creating Sukuna's ideal vessel would represent betrayal of parental responsibility on scale that exceeds normal categories of family dysfunction or abandonment. The implications of conscious participation in schemes designed to make his child host for ultimate evil create moral complexities that resist simple judgment or understanding. The circumstances surrounding Yuji's birth and early development suggest planning that extended back generations through careful manipulation of bloodlines and family relationships that treated individual human beings as components in larger design rather than autonomous persons worthy of consideration and protection. The revelation that Jin was reincarnation of Sukuna's twin adds layers of cosmic significance to what might otherwise have been ordinary family tragedy, while raising questions about fate, free will, and the extent to which individual choices matter when operating within frameworks established by forces beyond human comprehension. The cannibalistic origin story that connects Jin to Sukuna through their shared womb experience creates disturbing parallels between father and son that suggest inherited tendencies toward violence or consumption that might manifest under specific circumstances or pressures. The casual way Sukuna mentioned eating his twin reveals attitude toward family relationships that treats even closest biological connections as resources to be exploited rather than bonds that create mutual obligation and care. The implications of Yuji being product of relationship between Kenjaku-possessed mother and father, who was spiritually connected to ultimate evil, extend beyond immediate concerns about cursed energy inheritance toward fundamental questions about identity, moral responsibility, and whether children can transcend the circumstances of their origin through conscious choice and developed character that rejects inherited tendencies toward destruction or manipulation. Nobara's missing mother represents different but equally mysterious form of parental absence that has shaped her development in ways both obvious and subtle, creating independence and self-reliance that serve her well as sorcerer, while potentially masking emotional needs and vulnerabilities that normal family relationships might have addressed through sustained connection and unconditional support throughout childhood and adolescence. The letter that Gojo left regarding her mother's whereabouts suggests knowledge that extends beyond casual observation towards specific information that could only have been obtained through investigation or connection to networks that monitor the activities of powerful sorcerers and their family members. The fact that Nobara showed no interest in pursuing this information reveals either healthy psychological boundaries that prevent her from being manipulated through family connections or defensive mechanisms that protect her from disappointment and emotional vulnerability. The relationship between Nobara and her grandmother provides glimpse into family dynamics, where older generation assumes responsibility for training and guidance, while parental generation remains mysteriously absent from circumstances that should have demanded their direct involvement and support. The grandmother's expertise in straw doll techniques suggests inherited family traditions that span multiple generations, while raising questions about why such knowledge was not passed through normal parent-child parent relationships. The prestigious nature of Nobara's admission to Tokyo Jujutsu High indicates either exceptional natural ability that overcame lack of conventional family support, or behind-the-scenes advocacy from individuals whose influence within Jujutsu society exceeded what her visible family connections might suggest. The combination of her grandmother's teachings and institutional support that facilitated her education implies networks of relationship and obligation that operate beyond normal family structures. The pattern of absent parents among powerful young sorcerers suggests either systematic targeting of family relationships by hostile forces that seek to isolate and manipulate exceptional individuals, or natural consequences of possessing abilities that create dangers and complications too severe for normal family structures to accommodate effectively while maintaining psychological health and social stability. The protective instincts that might motivate parental absence represent tragic calculation that separation serves children's welfare better than presence that could expose them to additional dangers or create vulnerabilities that enemy might exploit. The sacrifice of normal family relationships for sake of physical safety and strategic advantage creates forms of loss that resist simple evaluation or moral judgment, while producing psychological effects that shape development in profound ways. The economic and social challenges that single-parent households face when dealing with children whose supernatural abilities require specialized education and training create practical obstacles that might force difficult choices about resource allocation and priorities that favor survival over emotional connection, safety over psychological development, strategic advantage over family cohesion and mutual support. The investigation that would be required to locate missing parents represents potential security risks that might endanger not only the missing individuals, but their children and associates through exposure of information that hostile forces could use to plan attacks or manipulation campaigns. The decision to maintain ignorance about family connections might reflect wisdom about operational security rather than callous indifference to personal relationships. The possibility that missing parents are actively serving supernatural community in roles that require separation from their children suggests sacrifice of personal happiness and family connection for broader purposes that serve collective welfare while imposing individual costs that challenge normal understanding of parental obligation and family priority over external responsibilities and abstract principles. The trauma that results from unexplained parental absence creates psychological wounds that might never heal completely, while also fostering resilience and independence that prove valuable for individuals whose adult lives will involve constant danger and responsibility for others' welfare, under conditions where emotional vulnerability could prove catastrophic for themselves and those they seek to protect. And so the mystery of the vanishing parents persists as testament to complexity of family relationships under extraordinary circumstances where normal expectations about presence, protection, and emotional support must be balanced against considerations of safety, strategy, and service to purposes that extend beyond individual welfare toward collective survival and the preservation of values that give such survival meaning, rather than mere biological continuation without moral framework or spiritual significance that makes existence worthwhile, despite its inevitable suffering and loss. In the aftermath of revolutionary upheaval that has shattered centuries of accumulated tradition and institutional authority, the Jujutsu world stands at crossroads, where every decision about reconstruction and reform will determine whether the future holds greater wisdom and justice, or merely different forms of oppression disguised as progress and enlightenment. The collapse of the Big Three clans and the systematic elimination of hierarchical structures that had governed supernatural society for generations creates unprecedented opportunity for transformation, while simultaneously threatening the stability and continuity that such institutions had provided. Despite their obvious flaws and moral shortcomings, the vacuum of leadership that has emerged from the destruction of traditional authority structures presents both liberation from oppressive systems and dangerous absence of experienced guidance that new generations will need as they navigate challenges that exceed anything their predecessors faced. During periods of relative stability and established protocol, the wisdom that was accumulated through centuries of institutional memory and practical experience cannot be easily replaced by good intentions and moral clarity, however necessary such qualities might be for creating more equitable and humane forms of social organization. The younger generation of sorcerers, who must now assume responsibilities that were previously distributed among multiple established hierarchies, face psychological and practical challenges that their education and development had not adequately prepared them to handle effectively. The accelerated maturation that recent conflicts forced upon individuals like Yuji, Megumi, and their contemporaries created competence in specific areas, while leaving gaps in knowledge and experience that could prove crucial for long-term success in leadership roles that require sophisticated understanding of complex systems and competing interests. The institutional reforms that will be necessary to create more democratic and transparent forms of governance within Jujutsu society must balance accessibility and accountability with the practical requirements of managing supernatural conflicts that demand rapid decision-making and specialized knowledge that ordinary citizens cannot be expected to possess or evaluate effectively. The tension between democratic ideals and technocratic necessity creates ongoing challenges for developing systems that serve both effectiveness and legitimacy, while avoiding the corruption that had characterized previous arrangements. The international implications of Japan's internal transformation extend far beyond domestic concerns toward relationships with foreign sorcerer communities whose own power structures and strategic calculations will be affected by changes in one of the most influential supernatural societies in the global community. The precedent that successful revolution against traditional hierarchies creates may inspire similar movements elsewhere, while also generating defensive reactions from established authorities who recognize threats to their own positions and privileges. The economic foundations that had supported traditional clan structures through accumulated wealth and established business relationships must be reorganized to serve new leadership, while maintaining the material resources necessary for effective supernatural protection and institutional operation. The concentration of economic power that had characterized clan-based organization created both efficiency and vulnerability that replacement systems must address through alternative approaches to resource generation and distribution. The educational institutions that had perpetuated traditional values and hierarchical thinking require comprehensive reform that addresses not only curriculum content, but fundamental pedagogical approaches that shape how young sorcerers understand their relationships to authority, responsibility, and the broader human community they are sworn to protect. The balance between preserving valuable technical knowledge and eliminating oppressive ideologies demands careful analysis of which traditions serve constructive purposes and which merely maintain unjustified privilege. The relationship between Jujutsu society and ordinary civilian populations must be reimagined to reflect contemporary values about transparency, accountability, and democratic participation, while maintaining the security requirements that make complete openness about supernatural affairs potentially dangerous for all parties involved. The secrecy that had protected both sorcerers and civilians from mutual fear and misunderstanding cannot be eliminated entirely without creating new forms of danger and instability. The technological integration that characterizes modern society creates opportunities for improving communication, coordination, and resource management within Jujutsu institutions, while also creating vulnerabilities that hostile forces might exploit if appropriate security measures are not developed and maintained by individuals who understand both supernatural capabilities and contemporary information systems. The balance between innovation and security requires expertise that spans multiple domains of specialized knowledge. The legal frameworks that govern supernatural conflict and its intersection with ordinary law enforcement and judicial systems require updating to reflect new understanding of individual rights and collective responsibilities, while maintaining effectiveness in addressing threats that exceed normal civilian capacity for comprehension or response. The integration of supernatural and mundane legal systems demands careful coordination that respects both domains while serving justice and public welfare. The prevention of future extremists like Ghetto and Kenjaku requires systematic attention to the psychological and social conditions that create vulnerability to radicalization among individuals whose exceptional abilities might make their corruption particularly dangerous for society as a whole. The support systems and monitoring mechanisms that identify warning signs while respecting individual privacy and autonomy represent ongoing challenges that require constant adaptation and refinement. The cultural preservation that maintains valuable aspects of Jujutsu tradition while eliminating elements that conflict with contemporary moral understanding demands sophisticated analysis of which practices serve constructive purposes and which merely perpetuate historical patterns of discrimination and abuse. The distinction between essential knowledge and cultural baggage requires wisdom that comes from understanding both historical context and contemporary values. The mental health resources that address trauma from recent conflicts while building resilience for future challenges represent crucial investment in human capital that determines whether reform efforts will be sustained by psychologically healthy leaders or undermined by individuals whose unprocessed wounds create vulnerabilities that hostile forces might exploit. The recognition that supernatural power does not eliminate normal human needs for emotional support and therapeutic intervention marks significant advance in understanding. The alliance structures that connect reformed Jujutsu society with international partners and domestic institutions require careful negotiation that balances autonomy with cooperation, while avoiding both isolation and subordination to external authorities whose interests might not align with Japanese supernatural communities' welfare and development priorities. The diplomacy required for such relationship management demands skills that traditional warrior culture had not emphasized or developed systematically. The research and development initiatives that advance technical knowledge while addressing ethical concerns about human experimentation and dangerous applications require oversight mechanisms that balance innovation with responsibility while fostering creativity and discovery that might prove crucial for addressing future threats that exceed current capabilities and understanding. The integration of scientific methodology with supernatural investigation creates opportunities for breakthrough while demanding careful risk assessment. The succession planning that ensures continuity of leadership and institutional knowledge requires systematic attention to identifying and developing individuals whose capabilities and character qualify them for significant responsibility, while avoiding the nepotism and favoritism that had characterized traditional clan-based advancement. The meritocratic ideals that guide selection processes must be balanced with practical considerations about compatibility and effectiveness under specific circumstances. The crisis management protocols that address future supernatural emergencies require integration of reformed institutional structures with practical requirements for rapid response and decisive action that might not allow time for consultation and consensus building that normal democratic processes demand. The balance between accountability and effectiveness during emergencies represents ongoing tension that requires careful attention and regular reassessment. And so the future of Jujutsu society after revolution remains fundamentally uncertain, shaped by choices that will be made by individuals whose wisdom and character have been tested through extraordinary circumstances, but who must now prove their capacity for the different but equally demanding challenges of building institutions that serve both effectiveness and justice in protecting human welfare against forces that threaten not only physical survival, but the values and principles that make such survival meaningful, rather than mere biological continuation without moral framework or spiritual significance, that transcends immediate tactical concerns and strategic calculations. In the quiet spaces between resolution and renewal, where the echoes of great conflicts fade into memory while new challenges gather strength in shadows that have not yet taken definitive form, there persist threads of unfinished business that weave through the fabric of Jujutsu society like fault lines, waiting for the precise moment when accumulated pressure will reshape the landscape once again. These are not the grand mysteries that capture immediate attention, but the subtle continuities that connect past trauma to future possibility, creating patterns of potential that may remain dormant for years or decades before circumstances align to bring them into active manifestation. The cursed spirits that survived the systematic purges and battles of recent conflicts represent more than merely residual threats, requiring routine elimination but evolutionary pressure that will continue to shape how supernatural forces adapt to changing conditions within human society, and the defensive measures that have been developed to contain their influence. The intelligence and adaptability that some of these entities demonstrated during major confrontations suggests learning capacity that may allow them to develop countermeasures for traditional exorcism techniques while exploring new forms of manifestation that exploit weaknesses in reformed institutional structures. The international sorcerer communities, whose own power structures and strategic priorities have been affected by Japan's internal transformation, represent wildcards in calculations about future stability and cooperation that will determine whether reformed institutions can maintain effectiveness while dealing with external pressures and competing agendas that may not align with domestic priorities for justice and democratic participation. The diplomatic relationships that sustained previous arrangements may require renegotiation under circumstances where traditional authorities no longer exist to honor commitments or maintain established protocols for conflict resolution. The reality warping potential of Takaba's comedic technique represents perhaps the most unpredictable variable in any assessment of future developments, as his ability to manifest whatever he finds amusing creates possibilities for both catastrophic disruption and miraculous intervention that could reshape entire conflicts according to whims that operate outside normal strategic calculation or tactical planning. The question of whether his powers have limits or safeguards that prevent unintended consequences, touches on fundamental concerns about individual capability, exceeding institutional capacity for oversight and guidance. The psychological dimensions of Takaba's technique raise additional concerns about the relationship between conscious intent and subconscious desire in determining how reality alteration manifests under stress or emotional pressure that might compromise his ability to maintain appropriate boundaries between entertainment and intervention in serious conflicts. The potential for his technique to respond to suppressed wishes or traumatic associations rather than conscious humor could create situations where his presence becomes liability rather than asset for any organization attempting to deploy his capabilities strategically. The emergence of new special grade threats from sources that remain hidden or dormant until specific conditions trigger their activation represents ongoing vulnerability that reformed institutions must address through improved intelligence, gathering and threat assessment protocols that exceed anything achieved by previous generations whose focus on traditional enemies may have created blind spots for novel forms of supernatural danger that operate according to different principles and objectives. The pattern of cyclical conflict that has characterized Jujutsu history suggests that periods of apparent stability and progress are typically followed by emergence of new challenges that test reformed systems and evolved understanding in ways that reveal weaknesses and gaps that were not apparent during initial reconstruction efforts. The preparation for such inevitabilities requires institutional memory and adaptive capacity that can function effectively even when leadership changes or circumstances exceed the specific scenarios that informed original planning, development. Megumi's psychological recovery from the trauma of possession and manipulation represents crucial variable in determining whether the next generation of leadership will possess the emotional stability and moral clarity necessary for effective decision-making under pressure that challenges personal resilience and professional competence simultaneously. The integration of his inherited techniques with psychological healing that allows healthy relationships and sound judgment will be essential for his continued development as individual and leader. The 10 Shadows technique that Megumi inherited carries implications beyond immediate tactical applications toward questions about how traditional abilities will be adapted and employed under reformed institutional frameworks that prioritize different values and objectives than those that shaped original development and transmission of such capabilities through clan-based educational systems. The evolution of technique applications to serve new purposes while maintaining effectiveness requires innovation that respects tradition while embracing necessary change. The next generation of students who will be educated under reformed institutional structures represent both hope for continued improvement and vulnerability to mistakes and oversights that might not become apparent until they assume positions of significant responsibility, where errors in judgment or preparation could have consequences extending far beyond personal failure towards systemic breakdown that affects entire communities dependent upon their protection and guidance. The curriculum development that shapes how future sorcerers understand their roles and responsibilities requires careful balance between technical instruction and moral education that produces individuals capable of wielding power wisely while remaining connected to human values and community welfare, rather than becoming isolated by their capabilities or corrupted by the temptations that exceptional ability creates for those who lack adequate ethical foundation and emotional support. The hidden techniques and applications that remain undiscovered or undeveloped represent both opportunities for breakthrough that could revolutionize supernatural protection and risks that such innovations might be discovered first by hostile forces who could exploit them for purposes incompatible with human welfare and social stability. The research priorities that guide exploration of new possibilities must balance potential benefits with acceptable risks while maintaining security that prevents dangerous knowledge from falling into wrong hands. The institutional knowledge that was lost through the elimination of traditional clan structures includes not only technical information but practical wisdom about managing complex organizations under pressure while maintaining morale and effectiveness, despite setbacks and challenges that test both individual resolve and collective commitment to shared goals and values. The reconstruction of such knowledge through experience rather than transmission requires time and resources that may not be available during crisis situations. The economic systems that will support reformed institutions must address not only immediate operational needs, but long-term sustainability that allows continued effectiveness without dependence on arrangements that might compromise independence or create vulnerabilities that hostile forces could exploit through economic pressure or manipulation of resource availability. The development of alternative funding sources requires innovation and risk-taking that may not align with security requirements. The technology integration that offers possibilities for improved communication and coordination also creates new forms of vulnerability to surveillance and manipulation by entities whose capabilities exceed traditional understanding of information security and data protection. The balance between innovation and security requires constant adaptation, as both beneficial and threatening applications of technology continue to evolve at accelerating pace that challenges institutional capacity for oversight and regulation. And so we reach the end of our journey through the unanswered questions that haunt the world of Jujutsu sorcery, those mysteries that remind us that even in a realm of supernatural power, some secrets are meant to remain hidden in the spaces between understanding and wonder. These riddles are not flaws in the tapestry of this extraordinary world, but threads that give it texture and depth, inviting us to imagine what lies beyond the boundaries of what we know. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all is how these unanswered questions enhance, rather than diminish, the beauty of the story, creating spaces where our own curiosity can flourish and grow. In the gentle darkness of sleep, let these enigmas become not sources of frustration, but lullabies of possibility, reminders that some of life's most profound truths are found not in answers, but in the courage to keep questioning. Rest now, fellow seeker of hidden truths. Let the mysteries of the Jujutsu world carry you into dreams where all questions find their perfect, peaceful resolution in the infinite realm of imagination.